Yaakov has the covenantal blessing. What Yaakov has committed himself to doing in the neder that he takes when he runs away from his brother is that I will build a house, he says. He calls his family the house, Beit Elohim. And Beit Elohim means that every member is included in some way. It does not mean that they are all the same. It is quite clear from the blessings Yaakov will mete out in the next chapter that it doesn't treat them all the same. Some have more significant blessings, some less, but they're all included. And that's the critical point. The problem has been that in the story of Yaakov, his family, there's one of his sons who has very much been excluded, namely Yosef, the brothers having either sold him directly or more likely caused his sale, but initially thought to actually kill him. And Yosef then goes on, has a separate life in the land of Egypt, rises to great prominence. But the question is, of course, is Yosef part of the family? Because if we're looking at Yosef from all objective criteria, he's fully an Egyptian. He's very high up in the Egyptian political scene, maybe even second to Pharaoh. He dresses like an Egyptian. He has his chariot. He has an Egyptian name. He has an Egyptian wife. He names his first son Forgetfulness. So he's in charge of the economy of Egypt. And the question is, Yaakov being sent down to Mitzrayim, the question is, can Yosef somehow be included? So the argument that I have presented in the past and last week as well is that on one hand, there's a tension between Yosef and his brothers, and that tension can be lessened. But at the end of the day, even in the very last chapter of the book, it's fair to say that the brothers don't actually trust him. They believe after Yaakov dies, he plans to kill them. So the way Yaakov wants to include Yosef is not by giving the blessing directly to Yosef, but by giving blessings to Yosef's children, whom Yaakov will make part of his family. Yosef's children, his grandchildren. Yaakov says to Yosef that Menashe, Ephraim and Menashe, Ki Ruvain v'Shimon Yuli, they're like Ruvain and Shimon, it means they're like my own sons. He's going to bless them as he would bless his own children. And the additional interesting feature to that is that in blessing Yosef through the children, since he has two children, Ephraim and Menashe, and Yaakov includes them both in the family, that suddenly Yosef has an extra portion. The extra portion, typically in the Torah, we know that from later goes to the firstborn, goes to the Bechor. The Bechor is not Joseph, the Bechor is Ruvain. But Ruvain will be stripped of the primacy of the Bechorah explicitly in the next chapter. And in a certain sense, Yosef is the Bechor, in the sense that he's the Bechor of Yaakov's wife, Rachel. And that's the woman that Yaakov wanted to marry in the first place. He wants to have his child through Rachel. There are many twists and turns. So Yosef is the Bechor. So we have a strange anomaly here that on one hand, Yosef is excluded in a sense, but secondly, he's actually included. And not only is he included, but he has the extra portion. That's what Yaakov is doing here in chapter 48. But again, he's trying to fulfill his vision of inclusion. And he ended last week with the argument that not only does Yaakov include Yosef in chapter 48, but he actually includes somebody else who could be seen as excluded, and that's his beloved Rachel, who dies by derech. She died on the way back. She died having stolen her father's idols. And the question then becomes, how does one view Rachel? You see Rachel as being excluded from the family. She's not buried with the Abraham and Sarah and Rebecca and Yitzchak, etc. What do we see? Do we want to look at her differently? And Yaakov chooses to look at it differently. He sees the Baderech as she was on the way back. And he interprets God's speech to him in chapter 35. We talked about this last week. He reinterprets what God said in chapter 35 to mean that Yaakov will continue to have more children, and specifically through Rachel, who has died. Yes, she's died. But nonetheless, her grandchildren and Yaakov's grandchildren are part of the family. Her grandchildren, through her son Joseph, these are the extra children that Rachel has. So Yaakov does two things. He includes Joseph through the children. He also includes Rachel through the children. That's what we talked about last week. I want to pick up with this, continue with this theme this week and complete chapter 48, and then we'll move to chapter 49. So we're sort of in the middle of chapter 48. Let's start with verse number 10. So it says in verse number 10 of chapter 48, it says, V'yenei Yisrael kavdu mizokin lo yuchal lirot. So it says that Jacob's eyes were heavy from his age, old age, dim. He could not see. Lo yuchal. It's a very explicit statement. In the case of Yitzchak, in the parallel story, there it says, V'techena einav merot. His eyes were dim. Keha, were weak. But here it says more than that. Here it says he actually can't see. Lo yuchal lirot. And therefore, he wants to bless these children, but he can't see them. So what he does in verse number 10 is Vayagesh otam elov, vayishak lahem, vayichabek lahem. He brings them close, maybe touching them. Vayishak, he kisses them. Vayichabek, he hugs them. Reminds us of the story of Yitzchak, who isn't sure that the person standing before him is Esav. He says, "Come close. Let me touch you. Let me feel you." He smells the garments, etc. Tries to compensate for the inability to see. Here too, it sounds like Yaakov is doing a similar thing. Vayigash, vayishak, vayichabek. But then the next verse is strange. It's where we left off last week. It says, "Vayomer Yisrael Yosef, v'yo fanecha lo filoti." I hadn't hoped, I never expected to see your face. V'hinei hera oti Elohim gam etzerecha. Now God has shown me your children. Hera has shown me. So in verse number 11, Yaakov says, I didn't expect to see you. Now I see even your children. The previous verse says he can't see. So what the Chumash is doing is purposely creating a big question. Yaakov said earlier, Ephraim and Menashe, Reuven and Shimon. And when he brings them close in verse number 8, Vayar Yisrael, he saw, it says, he sees Joseph's children. Vayomer Miela, who are they? What do you mean, who are they? You yourself said Ephraim and Menashe, like Reuven and Shimon, and they're standing in front of him. Who are they? So again, the Chumash wants the reader, that's us, to ask the question, how much does Yaakov really know? And remember, we read this story in light of the previous story where Yaakov himself tricked his father who couldn't see well. Stories are parallel stories. And again, one wonders, how much does Yaakov see or not see? We wonder, and Yosef has the same question, as we will see in a minute. Let's read a few more verses. Yosef otami imbrikav. Verse number 12. Joseph took his sons off his knees. Apparently they were sitting on his knees. I don't know how old they are. He took them off his knees. Vayishtachu li'apav arza, and they bowed down, presumably to Yaakov. They bowed low to the ground. The expression to take them off his knees. The knee, that's a kind of birthing symbol. In Latin, the word for knee is genus, sure enough, progeny. And later on in the Chumash, you don't have to go to the Latin, but later on in the Chumash, it talks about, before Joseph's death, it talks about that Joseph was 110 when he died, in chapter 50. And in verse number 23, Vayar Yosef Ephraim b'nei Shiloshim, Joseph lived to see the children of the third generation of Ephraim, Gam b'nei Machir ben Menashe, and also the sons of Machir, the son of Menashe, Yuldu al Birkei Yosef, were likewise born upon Joseph's knees. So the knee suggests parenting, fatherhood, etc. And now Joseph, in our verse, in verse number 12 of chapter 48, Yosef otami imbrikav, he takes them off his knee. So it means he's sort of giving them up. Joseph is the father. But Yaakov has said Ephraim and Menashe are like Reuven and Shimon. They're my children. And one gets the sense over there here in verse number 12 that Yosef is, at least for the moment, relinquishing his children. Yosef otame im b'kov, and they bowed down. And now we come to the blessing of Ephraim and Menashe. So this is verse number 13 of chapter 48. I'll read a couple more verses, then I'll stop and take comments and questions. There's Vayikach Yosef et Shneim. So Joseph takes them both. Et Ephraim bimino mismol Yisrael. And now Ephraim is standing to Joseph's right as he faces Yaakov. But Joseph's right, if you're facing somebody, so your right is the person you're facing's left. So Joseph takes Ephraim, puts him on the right side, which is to the left of Jacob, of Israel. V'et Menashe bismolo bimin Yisrael. And he put Menashe on his left side, which is to Israel's right. Vayagesh Elav, and he brought them close. Now here the question is, I think, a very obvious question, which is the following. The Chumash wants to say, presumably, that Yosef is bringing his two sons towards Yaakov. He wants Menashe, his eldest, to stand on Yaakov's right, and he wants Ephraim, the younger, to stand on Yaakov's left. That's Yosef's intention. The right hand being more significant. The Torah speaks sometimes of the right hand of God bringing salvation. Yamincha Hashem nedori b'koach. The Yamin in general is seen as more significant. The left is seen as not as important, sometimes even has a negative quality to it. That's all well and fine. But the Chumash says more than that. The Chumash could have said that very simply, and Joseph took Ephraim and put him on Jacob's left and took Menashe to Jacob's right. But the Torah just says more than that. The Torah says Joseph walked towards his father with Ephraim on his right and Menashe on his left, which conversely means that Menashe is on Yaakov's right and Ephraim's on Yaakov's left. But why did the Torah tell us about how they're positioned vis-a-vis Yosef? The important point, presumably, is how they're positioned vis-a-vis Yaakov. So clearly, there's something here. And what I believe is here is what the Torah is saying is, even as Yosef is bringing the children to be blessed by their grandfather, by Yosef's father, however, the position vis-a-vis Yosef is also significant. We have to remember that. Because what Yaakov is going to say to Yosef, and we'll see this in the very next verse, it says, "Vayishlach Yisrael et Yemino vayoshet arosh Ephraim hu atzair v'et smalo arosh Menashe sikel et yadav ki Menashe habachar." What does Yaakov do? He switches his hands. He takes his right hand and he crosses over his right hand and puts it on the head of Ephraim, who stands to his left. And he takes his left hand and he puts it on the head of Menashe, who stands to his right. Now, the important point over here is what Yaakov does not do is to reposition the children. He leaves the children exactly as they are. He just repositions his hands. He puts his right hand on the head of Ephraim and his left hand on the head of Menashe. So the reader, that's us, wonders why he does that. He could have switched them, presumably. And now he's going to bless them. And the blessing, which begins in the next verse, in verse number 15, it says, "Vayivarech et Yosef vayomar." So before we get to the nature of the blessing, what we are struck by is the beginning of verse number 15. It's not what we expected to say. What we expected to say is, "Vayivarech otam lemar." He blessed them, saying, because he's going to issue a joint blessing to Ephraim and Menashe. But the Chumash, remarkably, in verse number 15, doesn't say that. It says he blessed Joseph, saying. So the blessing is a blessing to Yosef. And I think the part of that is what I already explained, that basically through Joseph's children, he's blessing Joseph. That is to say, he includes Joseph through Joseph's children. But beyond that, he's saying something else, I think, which is, and this is what the Chumash is after. He says, Joseph, the way the boys stand next to you, you have them positioned correctly. In other words, I'm telling you something, Yosef. Ephraim always has to be on your right, and Menashe is on your left. Now, of course, the question is, that's all well and good, but the question then becomes, what is the issue of Menashe and Ephraim? Because the Chumash has told us absolutely nothing about Menashe or Ephraim. The Midrashim abounds, but in terms of the simple text that we have before us, what do we know about Ephraim and what do we know about Menashe? To which the answer is, we know one thing about Menashe and Ephraim, and only one. We know, at least here, later in the Chumash there are other things, but in Sefer Bereshit we know one thing. We know the reason that Yosef named Menashe and the reason Yosef named Ephraim. Menashe, we are told, Joseph named him Menashe. Joseph has two sons before the famine. It takes place back in chapter 41. And there it says he named his oldest son Menashe, for he said, his first son Menashe, for he said, Nashani Elohim et Amali et Kol Beit Avi. God has enabled me, Nashani, to forget my suffering and my father's house. That is Menashe. So the term Menashe means to forget, Shias, forgetfulness. And what Joseph is saying in effect is that I came to Egypt as a slave, a Hebrew slave, no less. Nothing in my pocket, came as a slave, and I have succeeded. Look where I am today. I came with nothing. It's often the story of the Jewish people in exile, come with nothing, having been abused, persecuted, or whatever. And suddenly, amazingly so, there's a coming with 7 cents in your pocket, and suddenly you find yourself very successful. So Yosef is very proud of that, understandably. I did it with nobody's help. I mean, God helps him, but no human being has helped me. On the contrary, I came from my family tried to kill me or sold me or whatever he believes to be the case. And here I am today. That's Menashe. Ephraim, the second son of Ephraim, the Chumash said back in chapter 41, the second son he called Ephraim, Yifrani Elohim be Eretz Anyi, because God has enabled me, made me fruitful in the land of Anyi. Now, the word Anyi is one of those key words in Sefer Bereshit, persecution, suffering. It's one of the covenantal terms, Avadum v'inu otam. But the second son refers to Yifrani Elohim be Eretz Anyi. It may be true that Joseph remembers Menashe, he remembers Amali, his travail back in the land of Canaan, and the relationship to his father's house, which he wants to forget. But the second child, namely Ephraim, he says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So he calls Mitzrayim, Eretz Anyi. And therein lies the dispute between Yaakov and Yosef. For Yosef, he loves both his children, but the point is, he's most proud of what Menashe represents. He's proud of, look how far I came on my own with nobody's help. And I was able to start a new life in the land of Mitzrayim. You know, it's just to digress for one moment. There was a whole discussion, actually, came out of the Gush, dispute between Rabbi Meidan, Yaakov Meidan, and Yoel ben Nun. The question that they were asking, or the question that Ramban essentially raises, which is, why does Yosef not contact his father all of these years? Makes no attempt to contact his father. I mean, I think the question formulated that way, I'm not sure is a valid question, but he does say, I want to forget my past. So he actually wants to forget his past. He actively wants to forget his past. And they have their interpretations. But I believe sometimes the simple answer is the best. And that is, Yosef probably has many good memories of his past. He probably does love his father. I don't think he suspects his father consciously set him up to be sold. That I don't believe is possible in the text. That's a misreading, I believe. But he did cause Joseph to be sold, inadvertently caused because of his favoritism. But the point I'm making is sometimes something happens in your life, there's an episode in your life, you just put it behind you. That's not to say there weren't good pieces to it, but I'm not going back there. That's just, doesn't exist for me anymore. Today I am reborn and I'm starting again. That's what Menashe is about. I'm starting over again. And look how far I came. I started as a slave. I rose in the house of Potiphar. I had enormous power in Potiphar's house. Then we have the Mrs. Potiphar incident. I'm in jail, got out of jail through my own ability to interpret dreams. Here I am today. I provide food for the people of Egypt and the outlying lands, etc. That's Menashe. But for Yaakov, that can't work. For Yaakov, the primary son always has to be Ephraim, because Ephraim is Ephraim Elohim Be'eretz Anyi. Anyi is a covenantal term. Anyi means you're going to be persecuted someplace as part of the covenantal promise. So Anyi, the land of Mitzrayim for Yaakov, is never a place you can stay. It's temporary. It's a place of suffering. Yaakov knows all this. Yaakov understands the covenant. I'm not sure any of his children understand it, but he does. We'll get to that either this week or next. And so for Yaakov, Mitzrayim can never be primary. For Yaakov, it's always Ephraim is primary and Menashe is secondary. Yes, Menashe is significant. Yes, the ability of Yosef to flourish in the land of Mitzrayim is significant. And he brings redemption and he brings sustenance to a lot of people. That's all great, but it can never be primary. That's what they're fighting about over here. So this incredible fight between these two titans, clash of the titans, that's what they're fighting about. Now let's see what the blessing actually is, and I'll stop and take comments and questions. So Yaakov sends forth Yisrael, is called Vayishlach Yisrael et Yimino, Vayashat Rosh Ephraim v'Atzair v'Yasmol Rosh Menashe Sikel et Yadav Ki Menashe Abachar. So we're told that he switches his hands. Then the Chumash uses a very interesting term, Sikel et Yadav. Sikel et Yadav, the best interpretation, Sikel et Yadav. Here the translation we have before is changing his hands. That is certainly not changing his hands. No, that can't be. That's not a good translation. Changing his hands. Let's see. That's the translation. Was that JPS? Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's see what Koren says. What the Jerusalem Bible says. It's usually a more precise translation.
Yeah, Koren has changing its hands.
Koren has changing his hands also?
Yeah.
Yes, it does have that. Okay, I don't like it. Fine.
JPS has crossing his hands.
Crossing, I don't like either.
Okay.
Doesn't pick up the word sikeo. I'm quite convinced that the word sikeo is related to the word haskeo or seichel. That is acting in a clever way, in a cunning way.
Has maneuvered. He maneuvered his hands.
Maneuvered, yeah, but it does not picking up. The Hebrew picks up on the word seichel. For example, and I was thinking about the following. Joseph is very wise. Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh should choose a wise person and place that person over the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, well, if God is telling you all of this, no one is wiser than you. And the term that Joseph uses and Pharaoh echoes, Joseph said, you should find a person who's navon v'chacham, chachamim unavonim. Two different words for wisdom. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, well, a navon v'chacham kamocha. Joseph is a chacham and a navon. It's interesting that in the Ashkenazic text of the Shmona Esrei, in the first request of the Sephardim have a different text, but the Ashkenazim have three terms. The first thing we request is insight from God. Chanenu me'itcha deya bina v'haskel. Deya bina v'haskel. So Joseph, one might say, has bina and chachma, right? But haskel is Yaakov. And actually, in Divrei Hayamim, it describes Shlomo as having all three. Bina, they are, and maybe Chachma, Bina. The Sephardic text is Chachma, Bina, and Das, Chabad. Chachma, that's the Sephardic. So I think over here, Sikel et Yadav, yes, he maneuvers, he crosses, whatever, changes, but it picks up, but the Hebrew picks up on the word Sikel, which means no. He's not a doddering old fool. Far from it. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's been one gigantic setup where the reader and Joseph Kui think he doesn't know what he's doing. He's out of it, this old guy. No, says the Chumash. See, he does what he does in a clever way. He knows Menashe is the oldest. He knows the way Joseph positions them, but he's going to do it his way. He's going to bless them his way. And the blessing is interesting, and I'll stop and take comments and questions. Again, he blessed Joseph. Vayomer, he says, he says, the God before whom my parents, my grandparents, my fathers, he calls them, Avram and Yitzchak walked, the Avot, Avram and Yitzchak. The God who has been my shepherd, may Odi, from my beginnings. Odi is one of those words that has great significance in the Joseph narrative. Remember, Joseph always asked the question, Ha'od avichai? Ha'od avichai? Is my father still alive? Again, Joseph, ha'odenu chai. And when Yaakov hears about Yosef, he says incredulously, ha'odenu chai. And here we have that same word, it recalls, when we have that word, it recalls the statements both of Yaakov and Yosef about the other. There's a very deep love between these two people. And when Yaakov is saying, the God who shepherded me from my very beginnings, until this very day, this God, this is the God that I call upon to bless. Hamalach hagoel oti mikol ra, the God's messenger who has redeemed me from all evil. Yivarech et hanarim, should bless the children. Yikarei bahem shemi, and in them my name will be called. B'shem avotai Abraham v'Yitzchak, and the name of my ancestors, Avram and Yitzchak. In other words, my name is called in them, but not just me. It's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's the blessing of the Avot. The Yigul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz, and they will be a multitude, a teeming multitude upon the earth. I'll get to the Yigul in a minute. But the point I would make here is, first of all, point number one is, it is true that Yaakov placed his right hand on the head of Ephraim and his left hand on the head of Menashe. That is true. Yosef objects, we'll see. Yosef strenuously objects to this. But a very important point over here is that it may be true that the right hand's on the head of one, not the other. But the blessing that Yaakov gives to Menashe and Ephraim is actually identical. He doesn't give two separate blessings. He gives one blessing to both. And by giving one blessing to both, what he's really saying is one may have more prominence than the other, but they are equally included. That's what Yaakov is emphasizing over here. It's not one of them. It's both of them, because only with both of them does Joseph have the extra portion. The blessing to Joseph is we treat him like the firstborn. We treat him like the firstborn as evidenced by the fact that he has two sons who are part of the covenantal family. And that's a very important point. Again, it takes us back to the story of Judah and Tamar. In the story of Judah and Tamar, there are two different children that are born to Judah and Tamar, Peretz and Zerach. Okay, and Peretz jumps out first, but they're both included. They both have to be included because each one represents one of Judah's deceased children, one of Tamar's deceased husbands. So you can't, it's not one or the other. It's got to be both. And this is another model of inclusion in terms of Yosef's own family, which then becomes the model for Jacob's larger family, which is the next chapter, where he will end up blessing all of the sons. By saying he includes all of the sons, he critiques some of them, but they're all equally included. Here it's even more than that. Here they get exactly the identical blessing. So this is what Yaakov is doing over here. He's including both of them. Just one last word about the Yidul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz. So let me say the following: the Yidul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz. Then I'll stop and take comments and questions. It's a very strange expression. I don't think we have it any other place. The Yidgul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz. The Yidgul obviously is related to the word dag, which is a fish. The multiply like fish. But that's a very strange term, the Yidgul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz. And I was thinking that I saw in Jonathan Grossman's, he has this massive work on Breshit, many good things in the book, by the way. So he makes a comment over there that the Yidgul is a strange word. And he says, perhaps Yaakov didn't want to use the word V'yifru Arov, because V'yifru Arov would be playing on the name Ephraim. He didn't want in this blessing to be showing any favoritism to Ephraim over Menashe. The hands is one thing, but the blessing is actually identical. It's an interesting point, but it doesn't actually solve the problem, because it could have said V'yirbu, not V'yifru. It doesn't really explain the word V'yidgu. So it's a very good question. What is this V'yidgu Arov B'Kerev Haaretz? So I want to make a suggestion. I would call it highly speculative. So again, but whatever. In the spirit of seeking answers, I have a suggestion about V'yidgu Arov B'Kerev Haaretz. And the suggestion is the following. One of the things that we noticed when we studied Breshit and studied the story of Joseph, we noticed something very curious about the Joseph story. I mean, there are many, many things that are interesting about the Joseph story. This is a small detail. And that is that the number 5 comes up over and over again. Joseph says there are 2 years of famine, Od Chamesh Shanim, there'll be 5 more years. Yaakov sends Yosef sends Yehuda 5 brothers to speak to Paro. The Torah speaks of strengthening the land during the time of famine. When Israel leaves Egypt, number 5 comes up many times. Always wondered about the number 5. So the thought that I had, this is part of the speculation. The thought that I had was that actually Mitzrayim is a place of wealth, because Mitzrayim, there's no famine. Typically, it's unusual to be a famine in Mitzrayim. But the reason that typically there's no famine in Mitzrayim, Avram goes down to Mitzrayim, Yitzchak was going to go to Mitzrayim in terms of famine, because you have the Nile River, you have the waters. And actually, the Yamim, the waters, the teeming waters, which produce, for example, the fish, or produce the great sea serpents, that, taking us back to the very first chapter of this book, that was on the 5th day. The 5th day is the day that God creates the waters and that which come from the waters. The waters produce the fish, etc. And the point is that what Mitzrayim is about, the number 5, what Mitzrayim is about is this particular ability of the waters to produce that which can sustain you. So I'm wondering about the Yidgul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz, if Yaakov doesn't have the following in mind. Yaakov, when he blesses Joseph's children, talks about, in them shall my name be called Avram, and Yitzchak and Yaakov, they bear the name of the Avot. And he added that Hamalach HaGoel Oti Mikol Ra Yivarech Et HaNarim. the malach, the messenger, angel, a messenger, Yivarech, should bless the children. And what that recalls for us, Hamalach Hagoel Otimi Korah, Yivarech et Hanarim, what that recalls is the story when Jacob is running away from home in chapter 28. He's running from his brother. He's about to go into exile, and he has a dream. In the dream, he sees a ladder or a staircase to heaven. Above the staircase is God. And he sees the angels of God ascending and descending. And God speaks to Jacob in the dream, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to take care of you wherever you go. Even in exile, I'm going to watch over you. So the angels that Yaakov is referring to over here, the guardian angel, is coming out of Jacob's own experience when he went into exile. He went to the land of Haran, and then at the end of his life again into exile to the land of Mitzrayim. And what he's praying for here, and what he blesses Joseph's children is, you are going to be in a place of great wealth. You're going to be a place where the waters typically sustain everybody. And my blessing to you is, even in this land of Mitzrayim, I call it the land of the fifth day, land of the great waters. It's understanding that actually in Mitzrayim, the nation of Ephraim will be Egyptians. And Jacob said, who are these kids? He looks at them, he sees two Egyptian boys. Yes, I'm going to bless them with them, and they carry the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But no, Yaakov understands what's going to happen. They're not leaving Egypt. Even in Mitzrayim, let they be fruitful and multiply. So that's my suggestion about the Yigula Ro B'Kerev Haaretz. I wouldn't swear that it's right. I happen to like it, but I don't, again, it's speculative, but I think it's a possibility as to why we have this very strange Yigula Ro B'Kerev Haaretz. Okay, before I go further, let me stop here now and take any comments or questions anybody may have.
I'm trying to follow your line that even in Mitzrayim they should multiply. Could you elaborate on the phrase even? Despite
right,
what?
Even because, in other words, when I don't think he means always, he means to multiply. We have that later on. Etc. But I think it's beyond just physically multiplying. I think his prayer is that, and that's the first part of it, that in them shall my name be called, that even in Mitzrayim, even in the place of...
They should retain their identity?
Yes, retain their identity as the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even though over the years, it's easy to forget where you came from, but that's Yaakov's hope and prayer, and that you will be able to succeed, whatever that means. You retain your identity, first of all. And beyond that, even in a place which is so problematic, God will watch over you. Of course, Yaakov has made it clear that as far as he's concerned, he made this clear back in the end of chapter 47 when he said to Joseph, listen, here's I have two requests. The first request is, get me the heck out of this place. That's his first request. Before he says, take me, I don't want to be in Mitzrayim, he says. That's clear. I also want to go back to Kivrot Avotai. I want to be buried back with my Avot, he says, right? And what he's saying to Joseph's children, really to Joseph, he's saying it. He's saying to Yosef, but he's saying it through the children, that even in Mitzrayim, you should retain your identity as a Jew, and you should be able to succeed. So even while succeeding in Mitzrayim, that's always the fine line. You want to succeed in Mitzrayim, but on the other hand, you want to retain your identity. That is one of the core questions, I think, in the story of Yosef. And it's a core question, for example, in the story built on Yosef, which is Megillat Esther, that to really succeed in Mitzrayim, the closer you get to Pharaoh, the way it works is, the closer you get to Pharaoh, the more you have to give up on certain things. In other words, in the house of Potiphar, he's able to withstand Mrs. Potiphar. He ends up in jail. but he doesn't get involved with Mrs. Potiphar. But when he goes to Paro, and Paro says, "Do you want to work for me? You take my ring, take the chariot of Egypt, which represents Mitzrayim, and I give you a wife also." And the wife is the daughter of Potiphar, Kohen On. So he has two options. He could say, "No, thank you." And then Paro would say, "No, thank you. Okay, go back to jail the rest of your life." Or he can say, "What an opportunity, but it comes with a big price." And the price is you have to relinquish at least the external manifestations of being Jewish. Megillah Esther is a similar thing. The person who can save the Jews at the end of the day is a fully assimilated Jew. No one even knows she's Jewish. After several years, no one has a clue this woman is Jewish. So that comes with the territory. And there's always a balance. Mordechai's thinking is, okay, I'll be able to still do a lot of good. That probably is thinking. On the other hand, he doesn't want to relinquish his Jewish identity, and he almost gets killed and gets everybody else killed at the same time. So I think that's the balance over here. And Yaakov understands they're in Mitzrayim for a long time. He knows they're not going to leave. He knows this is part of the covenantal process. So he's praying that God should watch over the children, the same way God watched over me when I was in the house of Laban, when I was in exile. And in parallel, this Mitzrayim is parallel to the story of Laban. So God is saying the same malach should protect these children, and they should also retain their identity, and they should multiply in the land. Does anybody else have any comments or questions? Yes. Yes, speak.
Aside from their character, is there a significant that the younger son gets the blessing over the Bechor? That's Isaac, Joseph, and Ephraim, just their position in the family. Is there a significance to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's typically said, and I think there's something to it, what's typically said in the Chumash is that, at least in the narratives, that what the Chumash is saying is there's a kind of merit system. That it's not, perhaps in other cultures, the firstborn has primacy. And I think maybe what the Chumash is saying is it shouldn't depend just on the birth order, but it should also depend on merit, on who actually is more appropriate. So it's true that, the younger one typically, that's what's said. Last week I made a different suggestion, actually. Although what I said just now, many say this, and I actually believe there's something to it, that it's a kind of merit system. The point I made last week was that actually, in a funny kind of way, Ephraim is older than Menashe, in the sense that what Yaakov is saying to Yosef is, these are my children. So the one that's born closest to Yaakov's descent into Egypt actually is primary. If Menashe was older, he was born further away from Yaakov. Yaakov is, so that was the clever point of last week. But what you're suggesting, I think, has a lot of truth to it. Same thing with Moshe and Aaron. Aaron is older than Moshe. Moshe is the younger one. And I think we can see that, for the most part, that is the case. I think it has to do with, or just saying that it depends less upon the birth order and more upon who was appropriate for the particular task. So I think that's probably what it is.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Just as an aside, the assimilated Jew saving the people, Kissinger, and the current one, Blinken, being assimilated Jews who are saving the Jews. But what I wanted to ask you, if you agree to it, that in blessing both children, and it says he blessed Yosef, that he didn't bless the children, he blessed Yosef, is that maybe he also wants to unite these two aspects of Yosef's life and also of Jewish life. The one who can forget and restart anew, forgetting the past, and the other is the one who can thrive in the new land.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was trying to emphasize that nobody is actually excluded over here. In other words, they have the identical blessing. It's not just not excluded. It's the same blessing for both. He doesn't differentiate in terms of the blessing. They're both important. You need a Menashe and you need an Ephraim. And the truth of the matter is that in the Chumash, actually, I'm not talking about beyond the Chumash, but in the Chumash, one can certainly make the case that Menashe even is primary over Ephraim, because let's not forget that the story of Benot Sulaflad, for example, these are from Menashe. That B'nai Mochir ben Menashe, these are the ones who actually have a deep connection to the land. So it's ironic in a certain sense that the one who carries the name Menashe, and Yosef says, I want to forget the land, I want to forget my father's house, but it's Dafka Menashe in the Chumash who demonstrate a deep concern, a deep love of land, which is interesting. On the other hand, Ephraim, Yeshua ben Nun is from Ephraim, so they're both important. I'm not suggesting that it's one or the other, and I fully agree with you that each is important. Each is a certain aspect which is important. So we need both. But having to choose between the two, which is primary, which is secondary, there I think lies the fight between Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov, Menashe can never be primary. The idea of Menashe, of forgetting the past, forgetting the land, can't be primary, because the point about being in Mitzrayim, among other things, is it's a place where God doesn't speak. God speaks in the land. The last time God spoke was when Yaakov was leaving the land in chapter 46 and going down to Mitzrayim. God speaks to Yaakov. The next time God will speak is in the story of the burning bush, much, much later, and the message is, get out, I'm taking you out. So Mitzrayim is the place of God's silence. God doesn't speak. In fact, in the book of Shmuel, the first chapters are based upon Shmuel's story based upon Moshe. And in chapter 3, Shmuel is sitting in the temple, and it says the word of God was scarce in those days. God was not speaking, because there in the book of Shmuel, Shiloh, which is in the land of Israel, has become Mitzrayim. It's become corrupt. It's a place where God doesn't speak. God doesn't speak in a corrupt society, and except to say get out or to change it. And that's the story. So for Yaakov, primary is God's, the place one can communicate with God. And Mitzrayim is not that place. All right, anybody else?
Is it possible, just to continue your point about V'yidgu Larov, that it also means to be able to survive in an alien environment, V'yidgu Larov b'kerev haaretz, to be a fish on land?
That's interesting, right? That's an interesting point, yeah. Certainly, yeah, it's an interesting point. You know, it's right, the Kerev Haaretz is very striking, actually, but yeah, there's something to that. I mean, the Yidgu is actually very striking. I don't think we have it in any other place, this particular term of, you know, the Yidgu Laro. So it reminds me of the story of Rabbi Akiva, who's walking by the water, and he sees the fish in the water, and maybe there are people trying to catch the fish and harm the fish or whatever. And Rabbi Akiva says to the person that's with him, you know, it may be dangerous to be in the water, but if you take the fish to the land, the fish can't survive. And so the same thing with us. Okay, teaching Torah, it's dangerous, whatever it is, but that's where we belong. We belong in that world. If we leave that world and go to a different place, to the land, we can't survive that way. Anyway, it's an interesting observation. The Kerev Haaretz it is a good point. I have to think more about that. Okay, let's then continue. Let's see if we can finish up the chapter now. It says, Vayar Yosef, ki yashit aviv yad yamino al rosh Ephraim, vayeh Rabbi Einav. Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand on the head of Ephraim, vayeh Rabbi Einav. It was literally evil, bad in his eyes. Vayitzmoch yad aviv. So he grabs onto his father's hands. He actually grabs his father's hand. He tries to move his father's hand from the head of Ephraim to the head of Menashe. Joseph said to his father, no, father, it's not right. This one is the older one. Put your right hand on his head. The Ramban says he thought that his father simply didn't know. His father's making a mistake. That's the Ramban. He says because it's a chutzpah. It's going to grab Yaakov's hand. It's his aged father. It's going to pull his hand off, making a mistake. The Ramban says he thought, since he's making an error, maybe the blessing won't actually take effect. It's a blessing in error. That's the Ramban's interpretation. In any event, you see the dispute here between Yaakov and Yosef, good clash of the Titans. No, father, you're making a mistake. And after all, the Chumash has set all this up because can he see? Can he see? Who are these boys? I mean, how much does he know? And the story of Yitzchak always hovers in the background. And now we have Yaakov's response in verse number 19. Very important verse. Vayima'en aviv. His father refuses. Vayima'en aviv. Vayomer. Yodati b'ni yodati. I know, my son. I know. Gam hu yeli'am v'gam hu yigdal. He'll also become a nation. He'll also be great. V'yulam, however, achiv hakaton yigdal mimenu. But the younger shall be greater still. V'zaro yiyeh melo hagoyim. His offspring shall be plentiful enough for nations. So Yaakov refuses. Vayima'en aviv. And Yaakov says, I understand. I know. Yodati b'ni yodati. So let me say, I have several things to say about this verse, which I think is a very important verse, one of the great verses, culminating verse. And that is that the word Vayima'en appears 3 times in this book. 3 times Vayima'en. The first time it appears is the end of chapter 37, after Joseph has been sold into slavery. And the brothers have Joseph's coat and they bring it back to their father. Father, we found this. Do you recognize it? And Yaakov says, it's the coat of Joseph, my son is Tarof Taraf Yosef. Joseph has been torn to pieces. And all of his sons and daughters arose to console him. And he said, he refuses to be consoled. He refuses to be consoled. That's the end of chapter 37. In chapter 37, yes. Chapter 38 is Judah and Tamar. You get to chapter 39, you have the story of Joseph in the house of Potiphar. The first few verses rises to great prominence. And then we have the episode with Mrs. Potiphar. So Mrs. Potiphar propositions Joseph. And the Torah says, Vayima'en. And Joseph refuses. Vayima'en. He refuses. He explains why. So those 2 Vayima'ens, if you think about it, is a chapter that intervenes, Judah and Tamar. But if you take that chapter out, it's about Judah. They're right in great proximity, which is why the Medrash says he refuses. He saw his father's image. He saw his father's face. And the point is that in the first story, Vayima'en, Jacob refuses to give up on his son. Maybe he's still alive. Okay, he found his coat or whatever, blood-soaked coat. But I'm not going to be consoled because if I accept the consolation, I admit he died. I don't admit he died. I'm not going to give up on him until I know for sure. And the second story, says the Medrash, is about a child who can't forget his father. Even in Mitzrayim, even with the house of Mitzrayim and Potiphar and all that, and the success, there's something about Yosef that can't forget his father. And now we have the third Vayima'en. So I would say this way, Joseph grabs onto his father's hand. Father, you're making a mistake. This is the older one. Put your right hand on his head. And what Yaakov says, I'll use my own language, is, listen, son, I didn't give up on you way back when the whole world thought you were dead. I don't plan to give up on you now. If I go, your path is the wrong path. Your path is not the path of the Jewish people. Menashe can never be primary. And therefore, I'm not going to listen to you. That's number one. Vayima'en. Not because because I care about you. The blessing was a blessing to Joseph. And then he says something else. Yodati b'ni yodati. And I'll say 2 things about Yodati b'ni yodati. Number one is, it fits very well with what I said before about sikel et yodo, with seichel. He moves his hands wisely. And now he says Yodati. Deya bina v'haskel. There's Deya and there's Haskel. It's not an accident. I know exactly what I'm doing. But Yodati b'ni Yodati has actually another significance in this book. Of course, the word Yodah is a governing word in Sefer Bereshit, and even more so in Sefer Shemot. It appears in almost all the stories in Sefer Shemot. But over here in particular, Because when Yaakov says, Yaakov's blessing to Menashe and Ephraim was, Hamalach hagoel oti mikora yivarech et hanarim, that the guardian angel, the angel who guarded me when I was in exile, should also guard these children. That was the dream that Yaakov had back in chapter 28. When Yaakov wakes up from this dream where the angels are ascending and descending the staircase to heaven, Yaakov was very frightened. Yaakov said, "Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh." Surely God is in this place. V'anochi lo yadati. I did not know it. I went to sleep in the holiest place. I didn't understand where I am. Lo yadati. It's a statement of fact. He says, Yaakov says, listen, I have a lot to learn still. I'm running away from Esau. I went to sleep here by accident. I laid down here. I didn't really understand the significance, not just of this particular place. I didn't really see the right trajectory to my life. And that's when he takes his vow. That's when he vows to come back and to build God's house and to build the family and to build an inclusive structure. And now, towards the end of Yaakov's life, he turns to Yosef and says, Yodati b'ni Yodati. Now, let me tell you something. I know exactly what I'm doing. Because what I'm doing is not just about this moment. What I'm doing, what I've come down to do at the end of my life, is the culmination of all my life's work. Beginning when I first had to run away, and I made that promise to build the bayit, to build the inclusive structure. And the blessing to Ephraim and Menashe is part of that inclusive structure, but it has to be done in a way that reflects the deepest values, the values of Beit Elohim, the values of the God who spoke to me, the revelation that I experienced before I went into exile. That's the revelation of chapter 28, and it's a revelation of chapter 46, where God speaks to Jacob before he goes to Mitzrayim. So Yodati b'nei Yodati, my son, with all due respect, I know better than you. And this is the Yodati b'nei Yodati, this is the Sikel. And it's not about me, he says, it's about you. Because this is my way to include you. This is my way not to give up on you, even, O Viceroy of Egypt. I include you through the children. That's the Yodati b'nei Yodati. It's one of the great verses, I think, in this book, which has many great verses. Yodati b'nei Yodati, the third Vayima'en, and then Yaakov says, Vayivachem Vayoma Hu Lemar. Then Yaakov adds, on that day he blesses them, saying, V'cha Yivarech Yisrael Lemar, through you shall Israel bless. In other words, when the Israelites bless others or bless their children, they will say, Yisimcha Elohim ki Ephraim v'chim Menashe. God should make you like Ephraim and Menashe. Vayosem et Ephraim lifnei Menashe. But they put Ephraim first and Menashe second. And part of the blessing of the children, I think, over here, it's more than just Ephraim and Menashe, the order. But remember, I know I emphasize this, that it's a joint blessing. In blessing the children, it's important to give the children the same blessing. Even when you understand the differences between them, different abilities, different trajectories and all that. But what Yaakov is saying that the custom in Israel will be that when we bless collectively. Not just this one or that one, because to go back to the main point, they have the identical blessing. That's not true of anybody else. When Yaakov blesses his 12 sons, each one has a different blessing. But when he blesses these two sons, who essentially are Joseph, they're both Joseph. They're different, yes, but they're both included, and both must be included because that's where Joseph gets the extra portion, or in Yaakov's word, Shema Chad Alachecha, which we'll get to in one moment. Before we conclude here, let me just stop and take any other comments or questions. Then we'll complete the last two verses of chapter 48. Then I just have somebody else to say it for 2 minutes at the end. Anybody else? Otherwise, we'll just move forward with the last two verses of chapter 48. It's really one of the great chapters of the Bible. That's the truth of it. It's so powerful.
Zella, did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
No. Okay. Okay. Let's continue. Anybody just speak up? Anybody listening? Vayom Yisrael El Yosef, Hinei Anochi Meit. Says Yaakov says for Yisrael over here, I'm about to die. And God should be with you, and God will bring you back to the land of your ancestors. This is a very powerful statement. Remember, he's talking to Joseph. He's talking to the viceroy of Egypt, who came to meet him with his chariot, you know what I mean? And it's a remarkable statement. Remarkable, actually. God's going to bring you back to the land of your ancestors, Eretz Avotechem, which is the theme that he brings up in terms of Menashe and Ephraim. In them, will my name and the name of Yitzchak, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the Avot, will be called in them. So God's going to bring you back to the land. There's a lot to say about this last verse of chapter 48. Maybe we'll leave some of it for next week. But the question is, what does Shem Achad Al Achecha mean? So Shem Achad Al Achecha, Shem is a very difficult term to figure out over here. It's typically translated as an extra portion. Now again, we have to look and see in the Bible if Shem can actually mean a portion. You have to take a look at that. I believe there is one place where Shem could mean an extra portion. Certainly that's the sense of it over here. But however, the Torah could have used a different word for portion. So therefore, there's no doubt that the word Shem, which is a critical word in the book of Breshit, actually in the Bible in general, and in the Joseph narrative specifically, is very significant. Remember that Shem is the place to which Yosef was sent by his father to meet his brothers, to try to make peace. But by the time Yosef gets to Shem, they have already left Shem. They're not in Shem anymore. They're not in the city of brotherly love anymore. The truth of the matter is that in the book of Yoshua, the city of Shem is given to Joseph. That's where Joseph ends up in the land. He ends up in Shem. But the point I wanted to emphasize over here, maybe we'll talk more about Shem another time, but the point I want to make over here is Shem Achad Al Achecha. That what Yaakov is saying to Yosef, I think, is a really important point in terms of the Chumash. What he's saying is, I give you one portion more than your brothers. In other words, we talked about the idea of the firstborn getting the extra portion. The firstborn get an extra portion, but what's being divided up is divided up among all the brothers, among all the children. So therefore, what he's really saying to Yosef is, I give you the extra portion. I give you the blessing of the Bechor. That is true. But your blessing is in conjunction with the others. You have no separate blessing. You are one of the children. Okay, there's no tribe of Joseph per se. There's Menashe and Ephraim, but you are Menashe and Ephraim. And therefore, what he's saying to Joseph in effect is, we don't know how much Yaakov knows about what happened. We'll never know that. The Chumash is never explicit about it. Does Yaakov know about the brothers trying to kill him? Does Yaakov knows about the sale? The Chumash never says, actually. So that's an interesting question. How much does Yaakov know? Maybe we'll discuss that when we get to chapter 50. But my point is, there certainly are intimations that he knows more than he lets on. He certainly knows of the dispute because he knows that the brothers were very angry with Joseph. We know he sent Joseph to the brothers to make peace. So he knows about the inner turmoil of the tension. Does he know how far it went? It's hard to say. But what he's saying over here is that your blessing is in conjunction with them. In effect, what he's saying is, if he knows, you have to forgive them. You have to learn to live together with your brother. That's what he's saying to Yosef over here. He's also saying something else about Shem that we'll get to later. I'll just make one other observation here about Shem. And now, of course, the city of Shem was captured by Shimon and Levi, and next week we'll see that Yaakov condemns the behavior of Shimon and Levi in the strongest terms. And they don't. The city of Shem goes to Joseph, but it's strange. I will give you Shem, extra portion, that I took from the Amori with my sword and my bow. So what does that mean? We know how the city of Shem was defeated by Shimon and Levi. It was with their swords after they tricked the people of the males of the town, etc. So what does it mean over here? Asher lakachti, that I took from the Amori, b'chabi uvakashti. So I actually leave that for next week. We'll start with that next week. And next week we will jump into chapter 49, which is the blessing of all Yaakov's sons. The 12 sons, all are blessed. And then we move to the death and funeral of Yaakov at the end of Sefer Bereshit. And then hopefully during the course of this semester, we will begin the book of Shemot. I just wanted to say two things now, just to conclude with two things. First of all, it's on our minds all the time is the situation in Israel. It's hard to read these psukim, which are Jacob blessing the children. God who has redeemed me, God who has sent my messenger, should bless the young men. And the young men, our brothers, our children, are preparing for battle. We've already lost a fair number of young men and some women as well. I'm talking about the soldiers from the massacre and the murder of our brothers and sisters. So that's our prayer. Prayer is, of course, on our mind all the time. But I'm recalling the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos. I just wanted to conclude with the following announcement. By the way, that yeshiva has Drisha has a yeshiva in Israel, Yeshiva Drisha. Yeshiva where women were in morning, afternoon, evenings. It's actually an amazing place. And I'm not going to talk about it any length right now. It's a unique place. Unique today and unique actually in Jewish history. It's a real yeshiva for women that reach the highest levels of learning. It's located in Kfar Etzion. Kfar Etzion has taken in one of the southern cities, city of Shlomit. They're in Kfar Etzion. And our yeshiva, we resumed last week, learning morning, afternoon, and evening, but at the same time spending a lot of time with the families, with the people from the south, helping them in 100 different ways. Our Rosh Yeshiva is on a Chevra Kadisha, and the four main people in the yeshiva one has 3 sons and a husband in the army, one has 3 brothers in the army, and one has 2 brothers and a husband in the army. And we're in there, the yeshiva is working on the ground, doing whatever they can do to help people in great need. As are many, many people in Israel. The nation has come together. It's actually amazing to see what's happened. So all our prayers are with them. But the Gemara, it says in Masechah Shabbos, when after one dies, they ask that person 3 questions. Did you, in business, did you behave with integrity? Not only business. Did you behave with integrity and honesty? Kavata itim Torah. You set aside a time to study Torah. And Sipito Yeshua, did you pray for salvation? And of course, we're all praying for salvation. We're all praying that our people can withstand the terror, can find a way to eliminate terrorists, and find a way to create a safer environment for all around us, for them and for us. But it's also kavata itim Torah. The fact is that life does go on, and even if our hearts and minds and souls are there, but it's very important to do what we can do in terms of our own growth as well. I said kavata itim Torah because Drisha is engaged now in a very important project. Rivka Rosenwein, of blessed memory, died many years ago, 20 years ago. Our yahrzeit in a couple of weeks, and she got very involved in the study of Mishnah. Mishnah is really the gateway to Torah Shabbat Peh. So we have invited everyone to take upon themselves the study of Mishnah. We're going to begin this Tuesday with Seder Nashim, which begins with Masechet Yevamot, and I'm going to be leading the study of Masechet Yevamot every week. People study on their own. It's not the class. You study on your own each week. This time it'll be me for a while to summarize what's there, to raise questions, answer questions, etc. This afternoon at 1 o'clock, I'm giving an introduction to Tractate Yevamot of Kavata Itim Torah. Mission is a good thing. It's the gateway to Torah Shabbat Peh. It's something that, unlike the Daf Yomi, that takes really a lot of time. You do 2 Mishnayot a day, it takes maybe 20 minutes, 14 in a week. And when you complete the tractate and complete the Seder, there's a real sense of accomplishment, and it opens up the windows, and it gives you really a broad picture of our interpretive tradition. So I encourage everyone who can and has an interest to do this, and people who any age, young, old, doesn't matter. Everybody's invited. It's your own study. It'll be done in English and Hebrew, and each week we're going to try to do some kind of review. So that's the introduction we share this afternoon at 1. Everybody's invited to be Koveya Itim La Torah, and of course we are also Mitzapim Lishua. Pray for salvation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber, and thank you to everyone who is here and being part of our learning community. We have many more classes this fall Zman with Rabbi Nati Helfgott on Monday night, with Dr. Rachel First on Wednesday afternoon, and with Miss Rachel Gelfman-Schultz on Wednesday afternoon as well. Our Mishnah learning, which Rabbi Silber gave an incredible introduction to, starts I think today, this afternoon, and you can sign up for all those classes and much more at 578.4.drisha.org/fallsman. So you can sign up for those classes and get all the Zoom links for that there, and see you all next week. Thank you.